Hello again, my friends, and welcome back to episode 2 of the Desolate Dynasty horror podcast. I am the host and narrator of this podcast, Joshua Clark. Today, we will be reading another spooky tale to discuss the issue of identity. The questioning of one's identity is entirely within human nature. After all, if we truly did evolve to reason, and reason, in turn, is what sets us apart from the monkeys, then why should it be outside of the realm of possibilities that we begin to put too much thought into one's own identity? This is what my therapist argued when I brought the question to him. It was my own memories that brought the thought to mind. Memories are only written as experiences we have, either through stimuli of the real world or that simulated in dreams. As such, our memories, save for when we dream of being a man other than our true selves, all memories should coincide around us and from the viewpoint of us. Yet, as clear as polished crystal and as vivid as the bore of the work meeting just earlier in the week, I recall being another man. I remember another job, and I remember another family than the one I lived with. Politics, something I vowed never to partake in, was the career of this other man. The name of Richard Faraday felt engraved in my mind and many of my memories. Very conflicting, as my name is Gerald Tinchy. Enough was known of this farce identity for those I mentioned it to, that I felt urged to announce this anomaly to someone more fitting of the dealing in abnormal psychology. I am now free from a secure facility that I have been confined to for the past 3 months, after a series of farce memory recollection episodes. The first episode that brought me to entering a more controlled facility was about 8 months ago, in the past. I had been working my office job, one requiring the calling of various numbers to sell life insurance, as disdainful a career that is, when I was overcome with a bizarre compilation of audio and visual flashing. I was on a coffee break when the compilation ensued. Dark roast single serve from a Keurig K-cup. I'd never been a coffee person prior to this event, yet I had such an obscure craving, borderline necessity, to partake in this workplace ritual. The immediate impulse was this dark roast type, and having no prior taste, I chose to give it a gamble. The taste was surprisingly strong, but the effect immediately after were much more than I had been prepared for. My head pounded, felt as though the plates of my own skull were being pushed apart, and I felt a burning towards the center. Then, I heard it. The name Richard was called out from behind me. I turned to be greeted with a room that was not the break lounge. The floor was carpeted, a manila color, most of it save a stain on the ground where my coffee had been dropped in the initial shock. The name was called again, and I followed it. I recognized the name as my own, though I knew it not to be. I entered the next room, which was the kitchen in this home. I did not recognize, yet felt I belonged to. "Can you fetch me the peppers, Richard?" the voice said, as I stepped into the room and witnessed a beautiful woman standing over a steaming pot with a stirring spoon in hand. "Of course, Edna," I stated, somehow knowing the name of this person by heart. I kneeled before the fridge, pulling out a chilled drawer and retrieving a small red bell pepper. As I began to stand, she quickly asserted, No, the yellow one," at which request I swapped peppers. As I stood, the scenery changed, and I saw the original break room I stood in before. I was as flabbergasted as my colleagues who stood over me, asking if I was alright. My vision was stained with red, and only after I rubbed my eyes with my left hand did I realize I had bled from both eyes, which now burned. My ears weren't much better off, as I cleaned them out with the earwax cleaner in the bathroom and noted the blood that began to dry on the wax. I took my hand and felt around on my skull, to ensure it had not truly been pushed apart as it felt like it would be, which, of course, was intact. One elderly manager at the time came to me as I exited the bathroom, after I had finished cleaning my eyes and ears, and he relieved me of the workday until I felt better. I passed through the break room, passing by one janitor who was on the ground cleaning drops of blood and spilt coffee, likely having no clue what I had witnessed. I had another of such episodes within the next week, following that incident. This episode was much less cinematic, as all I heard was the name, Richard, spoke from a man in a deep voice from across the room. I could not isolate the name of this man, the one whom spoke to me from across the room, but I did eerily recognize it. If I focus hard enough on the memory of this episode, I remember more words than just my name. "Have you been alright lately, Richard?" The unnamed voice questioned this alter ego. "I notice the nosebleeds have been getting more frequent. This can't be diagnosed as stress. You should really see Dr. Shirawa about this. He is, after all, where I got my condition diagnosed and cured." For about a week after this episode, I was hardly able to recall it, like putting together a puzzle in which the pictures on the pieces were smeared or rubbed off. As time went on, however, the words seemed to repeat themselves in the small voices and accents as what was pronounced in the original hallucination. Finally, after 3 weeks since the irregular compilation of voices and whispers, I knew a fraction of the story of this man by the name of Richard. His last name at this point still eluded me, but I knew that this was hardly the end of such episodes. Wait about 4 weeks from the point of the second, and I witnessed another episode. Once again in my office, I began to stand and stretch my legs after they cramped for maybe 3 hours of work, when my vision began to warp and contort. It was not the seemingly endless compilation and labyrinth of cubicles that is my workplace that I stood in now, but rather a long table with about 20 or so men and women sitting around it. I was not shocked to see it, even though I should have been. Instead, at the time of the sight, it felt like a perfectly normal day. I stepped into the room through a large set of double doors, a dark brown pair, which I had never before seen, though I felt as though I had, and sat down next to a man with an especially impressive set of facial hair. Richard, this man to my left with dark hair on his chin and mouth. Did you stop by the doctor as I suggested? No, my schedule has been quite packed this week, I replied in a voice I knew not to be my own, and let my wrinkled face stretch into a smile as I laughed quietly at my own negligence. I should be able to fit it in later next week. Are you certain they will be able to work out the issue of migraines and nosebleeds? I would rather not make such an investment of time or money into such a doctor if they can't actually do anything about this. Oh, but of course, this is the best migraine doctor in the country, and I'm sure he has seen a case or two similar to your own. Just as he said this, I felt a familiar pinching and then pulsating in my head, located at about the point at which the 3 skull plates meet each other. It felt as though a rod or stake was used to increase the gap size. I barely lasted long enough to witness the whole meeting, and even that appeared blurred. For a large portion of the meeting, I had my eyes clenched as well as my fists. Throughout my life, I had never experienced as much pain as the pounding, pulsating in my head. When the meeting concluded, I immediately ran off to the restroom. My nose had been bleeding once again, as had my eyes. I felt what I thought to be blood pooling in my skull, the crimson dye smeared down my face from my nostrils. I looked up from the sink, which I had been collecting the water to rinse off my face, and saw that I was once again myself. I was once again Gerald Tinchy, and with that thought, I noted my surroundings once more. This restroom was much less luxurious than the one I had departed from, but I recognized it as my own workplace, recognized the face as my own. The blood still spilled from my nose and eyes, though it at least begun to recede in ferocity. The pain in my skull had begun to recede as well, but it did follow me from this false reality I had just witnessed. This meant the issue wasn't pure hallucinatory, but a physical issue, at least that is how I judged it. The blood didn't yet dry, so it was relatively easy to wipe away from underneath my nose and eyes. Unfortunately, this wasn't some hidden experience. I was told immediately to make my way home by the managers, as my seeming loss of cognition, which preceded my waddling off to the restroom and nosebleed, had all been seen by someone in the next cubicle over. I chose to make an emergency visit to the doctor following these worsening episodes. And so the next day is when the next episode picks up. I had visited the doctor primarily on the pretense of nosebleeds and migraines, and I had plans to bring up the hallucinatory episodes. After checking in, I waited my name to be called from the waiting room, some sports magazine in my hand, though I failed to truly read it, as my thoughts had long since drifted. "Richard Furdy," I heard called from my seat in the back. I placed my magazine down, which had somehow turned out to be a Business Insider magazine by the end of my wait, and followed a pretty nurse towards the back. "Richard, right?" one older gentleman asked, holding out his hand. "Hi, I'm Dr. Ginsane. You are here on account of recent migraines, right?" "Yes, that's right," I stated in a quieter, more used voice than I had expected, though gave no thought to it at that point. "And nosebleeds. I'm told you are a good doctor for that topic?" "Yes, well, not to brag," Dr. Ginsane stated with a light chuckle, "but I am rated quite high as far as that topic goes. Now then, how often are you having these migraines?" "Lately, they've been increasing to well over half the days a month, and I think some of those may just be stress headaches," I say, letting my mind drift in thought. "Excluding those I believe to be the stress headaches, I would reduce the number to a quarter of the days each month." "Assume," he replies quickly, "that all headaches you have had over the past month or past year are in fact migraines. How many then?" Then I would place it back up to well over half the days a month," I say with a slight uncertainty. "At about what time each day do these migraines start?" he continues. "Roughly halfway through the day." We continued going on about this until finally I had the chance to slip in the topic. "Now, is hallucinations a possible symptom with chronic migraine issue?" I asked with slight haste and uncertainty. "Well, with the migraines, particularly with prodrome, or the stage before the actual migraine, there is the chance of a sufferer to experience auras, which are visible disturbances such as flashing lights, seeming camera flares, or audible disturbances. Not the most cinematic of hallucinations, but can fall under that grouping," the doctor explains with slight concern in his voice. "Are you experiencing these auras?" "Well, not exactly," I begin to reply, when I notice darkness fading in. I was uncertain why, but eventually, everything took on a dark red hue. The pain began to flare up at the same point in my skull, where the three plates met in unison. I suddenly was back in the waiting room, and I heard the name Gerald Tinchy called. Deja vu, I thought, wiping my nose with my hand and noticing blood. I followed an older, less attractive nurse to the back where I met with Dr. Jinsen, the name once again seeming to imbue me with a sense of deja vu. I had a very similar conversation with him, everything going precisely how I remember, save for when I slipped in the part of the hallucinations. At that point, his mouth turned down, clearly recalling something disturbing. His face seemed to turn slightly pale, which made me slow down my speech, and he asked me to pause entirely for just a moment. He chose not to spill out what it was that distraught him in such a way, but referred me to a psychologist. He stated that, if what I had explained was true, I should see a Dr. Springer at a particular mental institute funded by the hospital that I now stood in, the Arch Hospital. We exchanged contact, and I agreed to report any worsening episodes of migraine. We would discuss possible medication on a date scrawled upon a note card. The Arch Mental Institute brought about more questions, as well as more answers. I visited one weekend after the hospital, as advised by the doctor. Once again in a waiting room, I had spaced out when the world around me changed slightly. A magazine changed to a book, but I had not been all that involved in either, so I had hardly noted it. The name of Richard Faraday was called once more, and I approached a narrow hallway leading to one of the offices of the therapist. I entered the office of a Dr. Springer, who had been set up with me a week prior, and discussed the brawn of what it was that was bothering me psychologically. "You see, Doc," I explained with a slight lack of confidence, "I've been having some migraine episodes here and there, but what's more, I've been seeing and hearing things, like memories, hallucinated memories, dreams of world past built from memories that are not my own. Hallucinations, you say. Have you had such things before?" He replies with a callous voice. "Well, no, I have had no nature with schizophrenia, or any other mental condition which heavily associates with hallucinations." I voice my concern. "This has only started shortly after the migraines begun, which was no more than 7 months ago." "Alright, and of these memories, how do you know they are not your own?" He questioned me, showing very little interest in his tone, as if this was a line he had recited 1,000 times, and was bored. "Well, you see, they are associated with a name I have never heard," my own concern growing and showing. "A man by the name of Jeffrey Spacer is always the personality manifested as first person, and I always seem to identify as him when these episodes start, as if I was never Richard Furdy, but rather always Jeffrey Spacer." "What can you tell me about this Jeffrey Spacer?" he questions me, shifting in his seat. "Well," I began, then pausing a moment to think. "He is, or was, a retail worker at a gas station, convenience store, not far from here. I've never seen his face, either in pictures or mirrors. He seems to be, or have been, around 19 at the same time of most of these memories. He, too, has had chronic migraines, quite possibly similar hallucinatory issues. That aside, I know very little about him." "Ah, I see," the doctor said, trailing off slightly, then finishing with a quote I felt I had heard before. "The questioning of one's identity is entirely within human nature. After all, if we truly did evolve to reason, and reason is, in turn, what sets us apart from the monkeys, then why should it be outside of the realm of possibilities that we begin to put too much thought into one's own identity?" Just as he finishes, I heard the name of Gerald Tinsey called upon, and followed a recognizable narrow hallway to the office of a Dr. Springer. The conversation I could have predicted perfectly, and I could have answered all of his questions before they came. The answers, of course, being slightly different, as I was the true self, and the intrusive memories were from this Richard Furdy. He, once again, seemed bored with the conversation. I wondered to myself if he, too, had memories of all these conversations, or if I was just delusional. Once again, the doctor finished off with a quote. "The questioning of one's identity is entirely within human nature. After all, if we truly did evolve to reason, and reason, in turn, is what sets us apart from the monkeys, then why should it be outside the realm of possibilities that we begin to put too much thought into one's own identity?" Why he ignored the hallucination issue, or their effects upon, or effect by the migraines, I was uncertain about for a while. I went home with these questions, but also knew now that this intrusive identity experienced the same issue I had. Some kind of cycle which I had no knowledge and no energy to be able to break. That night I had dreams most bizarre. I was once again Richard, but something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The pain was flaring, and I stood at the bathroom sink, staring myself in the mirror. Protruding from the top of my head, where the plates of my skull met, was what resembled the leg of a bug of some type. Perhaps a cicada, the color seeming right, but the size was way off. I spat up blood, and my tears were a crimson color, but I could not scream for help. My skull felt like it was being pushed apart by something within, and I watched as the leg became 2, and then 3 on one side. The body was pushed out next. It appeared to be the exoskeleton of a large insect. The body was pushed from my splitting skull, slightly crushed and deformed by the pressure. I nearly collapsed from the pain as this monstrosity resembling no insect exoskeleton from our world was laying upon the sink counter. It had 6 legs, 3 on each side, a nearly spherical body, a head being no separate structure but rather incorporated into the whole, a small tail which appeared slightly cut off, likely extended further than the foot I saw. I felt my legs almost give out as I stared at this bloody exoskeleton of this monstrosity laid upon this counter, when suddenly I was overcome with an urge. I needed to clean this up and dispose of this inhuman mess. I received a rag from underneath the sink, ran water and collected in the sink with a decent quantity of soap to mix with the water, and begun to scrub the sink off. I was able to remove most of the crimson red color, but the issue of the exoskeleton still stood. I had 2 options. I could chuck it outside and claim no knowledge of it, or I could attempt to crush up the accursed thing and toss crumbs into a garbage bag. Both sounded disgusting, and if discovered, would merit a lot of explanation. I chose the latter of the options. I retrieved the disgusting husk and pushed inwards. It gave way surprisingly easy and shattered, making a disgusting crunch, like eating a spoon of dried cornflakes. Crumbs of the exoskeleton fell upon the counter, which I pushed into the garbage bin with a hand I removed from this disgusting husk. I changed the positioning of my hands and let them crunch through the putrid object once again. Another loud, crunching sound, and I feared I would wake my wife and daughter. I placed my hand at 2 more opposing positions and pushed sharply, as to ensure its breaking. It crunched again, and I let the dust of this object fall to the counter and pushed it into the bin. All the while this was happening, I had not even realized my skull plates were being pulled back together, seeming to repair all of the damage that was done. As the last of the powder was brushed into the bin, I woke with a sudden shake and cold sweat. A flare of pain erupted from my head, and I reached my hand up and felt a hard, perhaps sharp object protruding from the top. I was now myself again, Gerald Tinchy, and yet I felt this disgusting body from hallucination of another man protruding from my own body. I ran to the bathroom, letting myself vomit into the toilet, realizing after I flicked the light on, it was red. I anxiously turned my head and saw what I had feared before me once again. From my own head, not the head of this delusional entity, but my own real head, I saw the same leg of a giant cicada-like insect, sticking up where the 3 plates of my skull met. The exoskeleton once again made its painful expulsion into this world from my head, and once again I nearly collapsed as it fell upon the counter of the sink. I lived alone in reality, no wife or children whom I could wake or whom could witness this object laying upon the sink counter, so once I cleaned the blood, I chose to wait until the morning so I could witness the object with no doubt of its reality. I awoke late next morning, clearly having slept through my alarms. Then I suddenly recalled the experience from the previous night. I felt sweat beat itself upon my forehead. My heart felt like it was pounding itself out of my chest as I opened the door to the bathroom. Upon my sink was, as I had feared, the exoskeleton of this unearthly and ungodly insect. I reached my hand to my head and felt some congealed blood forming lines across my skull, where the damage had been mostly repaired. All the seams of skin where each plate of the skull seemed to have scarred, I noticed after taking a shower to wash off the blood. I turned once again to the disgusting exoskeleton. I witnessed it with much more time this morning than last time. I had seen it and studied it with curiosity and vigor. As I had noted, it had been but one body part, as well as legs to move and a tail at its rear, and what happened to be rods of some type, which could be used to feed upon the brain, perhaps. I didn't want to think about such an idea, and I could feel my mind blurring every time I tried, as if my mind wasn't supposed to have such thoughts, and I was doing the world an injustice by attempting to think them. I tried and tried, but fog gave way to pain, and I gave up on thinking it. I failed to make it to work that day, or the next, as I had some putrid knowledge I should not have obtained. There's a parasite inside my head. This insectoid exoskeleton was pushed from my skull because there is something inside. Something that makes up more than half the volume of my head and entered at a time I failed to notice. This would explain the migraines, but what about the memory distortions and the hallucinations? Why was I witnessing events recorded as memories for someone other than myself? These questions were all answered soon after. There was a ring, my doorbell, about 3 days after the exoskeleton had pushed its way out. The migraine episodes continued to get more frequent and worse. I approached the door, I wobbled, fell once or twice. I tripped down the stairs and entered into the living room, dazed and confused. I had hardly slept due to fear, confusion, and pain. I opened the door and was greeted by a buck-toothed mailman holding a clipboard parked a little ways outside my house. "Hi," he spoke immediately. "Are you Gerald Tinchy? I just need your signature here, and your packages." He paused, looking up, and let his jaw fall open. His eyes widened, and his face whitened. "Yes, I am Gerald," I began, before I collapsed for a final time, letting his terrified face be the last image I see as Gerald Tinchy. I awoke perhaps 3 hours later, now have more knowledge on the topic. I, Aaron Paul, had been instructed by the post office to deliver the package to Gerald Tinchy for the Ark Hospital. I had been told specifically to complete this job and this job alone. When I was done for the day, I would be paid a full day's wage. I was fine with this, less driving. I arrived at the house at 4:53 p.m., knocked on the door. I was greeted by the image truly beyond expression. I, Gerald Tinchy, walked out of the house, blood falling from my skull and pooling below. 2 of the plates of my, Gerald's, head were missing, revealing the unwholesome insectoid creature inside of the skull. The creature was finished with him, and released him, and he collapsed to the floor as the tail of the monster released itself from the spine, and the face detached from the frontal cortex, having already eaten away anything reminiscent of a brainstem or anything adjacent to it. It let its legs rise from the first time since making its home within his head, leapt immediately for my face like one of those face huggers from the movies. I blacked out there. I can't recall anything between then and now, as every time I try my mind fogs up. I fear I will lose everything else as well. I think I'm already missing moments from Gerald's life, and soon more may be covered up by this creature. As such, I have committed what I know of this whole experience to the clipboard I had on my person. Reflecting, I have but one message to myself if I forget, or anyone else who may try to read this. Do not trust the Arch Hospital. You should be no one.